we are so happy to be inaugurating the Think Tank Lab today together with you. For me personally, this feels almost like a family reunion, because I realize that I have spent over 15 years of my professional life in think tanks, a good chunk of which was at the European Policy Center. So a special hello to Ricardo in Brussels. And of course, to the many people on the screen who I've already had the great pleasure of working together with. That includes Christiana and Robin and Hannah and others. Again, a very good group of people to think through some of the challenges that we share communally. Think tanks are nothing if they're not learning organizations. I think if we fail that objective, we have failed some of the main purposes of all of our mission statements. So I'm glad that in convening a structure that will help us as German think tanks do our work better, we're doing it not in the way that the Penn ranking might want us to do it in competition, but we're doing it in collaboration. Because let's face it, we have many of the same challenges, not only obviously in the global political sphere, so problems that no organization could solve on their own, and that necessitate the fact that we bring the best ideas to the table, but that we bring them to bear in a way that creates influence, resonance, and speaks to our communities. And the best way that we can do that, and where we often, I think, still have a tendency to default, is in doing this with a diverse perspective. So bringing the kind of diversity that we need to ensure that we can bring up and have the most innovative and creative ideas possible. That means we have to benefit from a proliferation and a cascade and a difference of opinion. But we have to do these things in a timely fashion. We have to know where the levers of influence lie. I think for German think tanks that have just a very specific context in which they have to operate, in terms of how governance works, in terms of what we can offer our people in terms of growth opportunities and creating influence once they leave our doorsteps. It's a very specific context in which we operate. So some of our challenges are shared. Some of them are unique to our specific cultural context. But I think one thing is abundantly clear. The complexity of issues and the way that issues now converge globally but affect local populations as something we all share. So I'm so pleased that with the good funding and the support of the Robert Bosch Stiftung, the Stiftung Mercator, the collaboration with MERICS, we can all be together this afternoon to really lean into these issues. We want to think systemically with all of you over time in terms of how we can tackle these things together, but we also want to learn from you because, again, this gets back to our principal objective of learning, growing, and increasing our capacity and reach for action. So with that, let me turn it over to Mikko Huotari, and I will step away in part to, be respective of the Corona situation we still have. My many hearty greetings to all of you. I really look forward to this collaborative work, and thank you.
Also, good afternoon from my side. Absolutely thrilled to be here at this inaugural meeting of the Think Tank Lab. My thanks go out to all of you joining us today, but also obviously to the funders of this initiative, Bosch Foundation and also Mercator Foundation, our mothership. Also, my thanks again to Cathryn and the team at DGAP, everyone who's working in the background extremely hard to get this done today and hopefully working together efficiently in the next 2 years. My name is Mikko Huotari. I'm the Executive Director of MERICS, Mercator Institute for China Studies, and we're very pleased to be partnering with the DGAP today. I can tell you personally, DGAP is a special place for myself. I've been doing an internship here years ago, so to some extent, DGAP has been training myself already in the past, and I hope that our initiative today can be part of a longer-term effort to shape the German and wider think tank community with long-term initiatives and measures that benefit all of us. MERICS has benefited tremendously from partnerships in the past. We consider ourselves a complementary institution with our China expertise that we bring to the table. And we love working together with other institutions. And we've learned a lot, not only substantively, but also on the ways how we do research and how we create impact and how we work together. It's quite clear that the joint mission for this project needs to be that we really make this a learning space. And lab needs to be where we jointly reflect on the changing conditions of doing our work, where we look at how we need to adapt to a changing context in which our work takes place, but also constantly think about ways how to make think tank work that is career path, something that colleagues really want to pursue, where they grow and share their experiences in ways that are beneficial for all of us. So the shifting context, I think we can look at it from three different perspectives. One is the global context. Geopolitically, our work is becoming more contested and at the same time more relevant and important. With regard to the landscape that we operate in as organizations, it's also quite clear that polarization and politicization of information flows is something that we also have to deal with. And then again, COVID, I think, was a wake-up call with regard to the potential of how work conditions can shift. And that's certainly true for thinking and learning organizations such as the ones that we operate in. I want to end by saying that hopefully the think tank lab, and we'll do our best to deliver on that, will not be a navel-gazing exercise, but that we want to look at impact and improving impact for stakeholders, the wider public, but most importantly at this point, also for our community as fellow think tankers. And with that, I wish you a very good afternoon. Thanks again to all of our partners in this endeavor. And I would like to hand over to Claire from DGAP for the next session here. Thank you.
Also from my side, a wholehearted welcome to our kickoff event for the Think Tank Lab. My name is Claire Lucia Leifert. I'm heading the Think Tank Lab, and I'm very excited to be able to launch this initiative here today with all of you. You might have seen already by entering the event website that we didn't want to create your usual Zoom event. I think we've all had enough of Zoom meetings in the past 15 months, probably 7 or so per day. So we were thinking, how could we enable you to explore our vision for the Think Tank Lab? And frankly, think tanks in general. So what we came up with was a bright and inviting space for exchange, for learning, for experimenting and testing new ideas. And a place where people gather to discuss the policy problems of the day. The wall to the public and to politics, as you can see on our website, it's wide open. There isn't even a wall. It's just a breakthrough. And our vision, symbolized also by the German Parliament building, the Reichstag, which is in the background there, and people come in and out. Policymakers and the interested public are invited to come and go as they see fit. I invite you to explore that vision, to learn more about the Think Tank Lab and our activities by moving your mouse around the website. I think we would all have loved to welcome you here in Berlin, but this is, I guess, the best way we can allow you to explore the Think Tank Lab as a physical space online. You will see that different info boxes will come up as soon as you move with your mouse closer to them. And if you want to learn more about our plans for the pilot phase, which is running until the end of the year, you can enlarge and also download the infographic next to the video stream. The same can be done with the live stream itself. So you can just enlarge the video window if you haven't done it yet, just by clicking on it. So what will you see in that video window today? Often think tank events start with a keynote, followed by a discussion. Today, we decided to turn this usual structure on its head and start with a panel of think tank stakeholders to ask them, what do you expect from think tanks today? We will then hear a keynote response or comment by Dr. Robin Niblett, Director and Chief Executive at Chatham House, on what think tanks can do to become incubators for policy innovation. And after that, we will have the chance to ask our keynote speaker and our panelists some of the questions that you sent us with your registration. And of course, feel free to send us further questions through the chat. We will try to take them up in our discussion. In order to allow us all to see who is here and give you a bit of the community feeling that we and Mikko and Cathryn already talked about, and to get the conversation among all of us started, not only on the stage, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You'll find the chat on the right-hand side of the page. Just maybe write your name and your organization so all of us can see who's here today. With this, I'm handing over to my colleague, Roderick Kefferpitz from MERICS. He's project lead at MERICS at the Think Tank Lab, to introduce our panelists and get us started with the discussion.
Thank you, Claire. And I'm very excited to be here today, kicking off the Think Tank Lab with all of you who are here with us and who are behind the screen sharing with us at this event. My name is Roderick. I'm the MERICS project lead for the Think Tank Lab, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion. We have a stellar lineup of experts from the world of policymaking, journalism, and funding organizations, all key stakeholders to think tanks. And we want to know from them, what do they actually expect from us? What do they think we're doing good, and where do they think we actually need to improve the work that we do? And so let me just start briefly with an introduction of our panelists. With us today, we have Hanna Neumann, a member of the European Parliament, Christiane Hoffmann, a very well-known author and journalist with Der Spiegel. We have Ricardo Borges de Castro, an associate director with the European Policy Center and former advisor to the European Commission Presidents Barroso and Juncker, as well as Michael Schwartz, executive director of the Mercator Stiftung, one of our funders alongside the Robert Bosch Stiftung. And last but not least, we will also have Henry Althaker, senior vice president at the Robert Bosch Stiftung, who will wrap up our discussion and give us his main takeaways from the panel. So without much further ado, let's get straight into our discussion. And let me start maybe with the policymaker. Hanna, as a politician, what role do you see for think tanks in your work? I mean, are think tanks a must-have in your work, or are they just a nice-to-have, or if they didn't exist, it wouldn't even bother you?
Well, thanks, Roderick, first of all, for the introduction. And right now, I'm a politician, but most of you know that I have actually been walking back and forth between think tanks and politics for a while. So maybe I have a bit of a, let's say, more in-depth perspective on the two issues. Because I was aware that you're going to ask me that question, I tried to structure my input on two aspects. The first one is, what kind of content are we looking for with think tanks? Because they are a must-have, at least in the way how I do politics. And then how do we like to have this content, or how is it best basically to deal with us as politicians if you want to have an impact and access as think tankers? Because aside of the impact, or before the impact, there's actually the access issue. And I would like to pick up something that Cathryn said very much in the beginning, because think tanks want to have a leverage of influence. And for us as politicians, it's pretty much the same. I want to know, as a foreign policy maker, if I look at a certain conflict, if I look at a certain actor, if I look at a certain setting, what kind of influence do we with our politics? Because in foreign policy, it's not like domestic policy where you just make the policy and then you implement it and then you evaluate it. You are in foreign policy one of many actors. So for me, the first thing I want to know, be it with Syria or be it on Putin, what leverage of influence could I, as the European Union or as the German government or as the United Nations, depending on where I am a politician, can I actually have? And that's an answer that think tanks, I think, are in a very good position and often help me to give and to understand. Then the second thing is, when I know where the leverage could be that we could have as a certain institution or organization, what are the policy options? What are the different options on which we can decide? I know there are some think tanks that are very outspoken in like, this is the way you should handle this issue. Me personally, because I still think I'm the better politician, I would rather like to know what is the range of options that the European Union, for example, could have in a certain area. And then I could, based on, well, my political understanding, pick. So that's the kind of advice I like best. And I have to admit, especially for those of us who are opposition politicians, so who cannot rely on the vast intelligence and the vast information that is available in ministries, to which, if we are opposition politicians, we rarely have access. Think tanks are a very, very important source of information. So also, if your question is on whom do you best focus, I think especially opposition politicians are very thankful for any information they get. On the how, well, when do I seek advice from think tanks? If something happens, like now the Libya conference, 2 days in advance, usually I need to have a position because journalists come asking me, what is your position? Or I think I should do a press release before that because I deal with Libya. So I have a general knowledge of Libya, but what happened in the last 2 months? That's exactly when I turn to think tankers. And if you have a paper ready, because you not think of that 2 days in advance, because you think of that, let's say, a month or at least 2 weeks in advance, and you have a paper ready, that's when I look into it. Then there's the issue of network. If I work longer in Libya, like I do now, I know whom to call. If I want to have some, let's say, informal information, if I want to have a sparring partner, if I want to have like a safe space where I can also explore options, say, well, I would think of that if I work on a region longer. I would have my own ideas. And then I want to have a feedback from some expert telling me, okay, I think that's stupid because, or that's actually an interesting thought, but someone who has more in-depth knowledge, because we as politicians have to deal with so many topics at once. It's just impossible. The benchmark I would like to have for me, and that I had for me as a think tanker, of knowledge on a topic before I talk about it, it's impossible to do that when you are a politician. And I really think we should get rid of the illusion. And that's why if you are a good politician, I think that's when you turn to think tankers or other experts who you credit for having this knowledge. Aside of the papers, like you producing papers, and I especially love the executive summaries, and don't expect us, aside of like very specific issues. So you can have an executive summary, and then you would have like one part, what the EU could do. Then I would skip to that one and also read that one, but basically that's it. I know think tanks are lately, and I'm a modern politician, so I should like that, but I don't, into these like graphics and that move. And if you have bars and I want to have a paper that I have somewhere and that I can just read, and then I put it aside. I know it may be good for other audience to have all this fancy animated stuff, but we rarely make use of that, I have to admit. Aside of that, I think providing safe spaces for discussions beyond the paper is something highly valued. We may not always be able to make the time, but it's something we highly value, because when we discuss, for example, in committees, or when we are in panel discussion, public ones like this is not where we also can explore ideas and options. And maybe just a last bit, heavily rely on our staffers. They are really the ones that feed information into us. So even if you find it hard to have direct access to members of parliament, if you know the staff person in charge of the issue, that's very valuable, maybe even more valuable than us. Roderick, was that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots to take away. You know, the how, even the when. I thought it was really interesting to find out. You know, we are working for a long time on papers, and you need them though on short notice. When you see, I got a conference coming up as well. So a lot of points to think about. Let me move on and bring in Ms. Hoffmann from Der Spiegel, our journalist, because I see there might be also a little bit of a clash between think tanks and journalism, right? I mean, think tanks do analysis work, journalists do analysis work. How do you see the role of think tanks there? Are they competitors? Are they partners?
I do think they are partners, but I'd like to give sort of an anecdotal answer. As some of you might know, last year, together with Christoph Bertram, who used to be the head of SWP, the major German think tank, we did a study for Mercator and Bosch about the landscape of foreign policy think tanks in Germany. And for that, we did a series of interviews also with politicians. And what was really astonishing to me was that some of those more high-ranking politicians said that they actually preferred to talk to journalists rather than to think tankers. And they gave two reasons. One is that they said that journalists usually have more special knowledge that is unknown to them, whereas most of the knowledge that think tankers can provide, they can get from somewhere else. But journalists who work investigative and who have access to people in power can usually provide more interesting information to them. And the second point was that they said journalists were better in understanding the mechanisms of power and the necessities of politics, whereas think tankers were too far from politics to actually understand the forces that were working there. And so they were very frequently giving advice that was just unrealistic, that couldn't be implemented. And I'm not telling this because it's sort of flattering to a journalist to hear that, but because I think we can ask ourselves, what can think tanks learn from this? And this is one of the points I think that Hannah has made, is that, the timely providing of information, to look. I find that think tanks very often look for sort of a broad and common kind of information rather than special and the information that politicians need who are in the executive, who have to make quick discussions, who have very tight timetables. So I think, I think to become a bit more journalistic in some way could be helpful to think tanks, actually.
I think this is a really interesting point, if I can get straight into there, Christiane, because you were saying think tanks need to become more journalistic in the sense that they need to understand power and politics better. And maybe let me use that opportunity also, because Hannah said a lot of the times it's maybe better to not get in touch with the politician, but get in touch with some of the people behind the scenes. And so there, I would just actually bring in Ricardo, who is one of those guys behind the scenes. I mean, Ricardo, you've been there in the machine room of political power at the European Commission, working for Presidents Barroso and Presidents Juncker. Would you agree with that? Are think tanks, is there a lack of understanding when it comes to political power? What was the good, the bad, and the ugly that you saw with think tank work?
Well, thanks very much, Roderick, and I'm delighted also to join everyone in this conversation, and congratulations on the launching of the Think Tank Lab. I find very interesting what both Anna and Christian have said. I mean, probably, I would lump the ugly and the bads together, and then I'll focus on the good, if you allow me. But I would say that the ugly really, and from my personal experience, was really, the lack of time, the information overloads, and the frantic pace of things at that level. There's very little time to be able to consume, quantities of information, and also because there's huge competition. I mean, not only from journalists, because when you get to the office in the morning, you have the newspapers, you have a big book of press clippings and all of these things. Then you have the newsletters in your email, and then you start, getting called for, for meetings, for this, for that. So, the attention span is very limited. And if at my level, it's very limited now, imagine what it is for a president of an institution, or for a prime minister, or for someone that is in the executive office. So I'll say that, the ugly is really the time and the ability to be able to consume that information. I would say the bad is that I would have wished to have much more time to engage with think tankers and with this type of thing than I had the opportunity to. Also because, and this is, I would sort of start making my transition as a consumer of this information to sort of a hybrid format when I joined the Commission's think tank, where I was sort of a producer of information, but also a consumer of information. But what I'm trying to say, when you are at the president's office, there is a mediation element, which is this think tank of the Commission. I'm now giving a concrete example where the interaction between think tankers and the Commission is normally done by that office. Doesn't mean that you individually cannot do that, but there's a lot of information that is filtered through that mechanism. And now, I mean, let's go to the good. I mean, the good is that, for example, President Barroso, for the State of the Union, in the process of preparing the State of the Union speech, there will always be interaction with think tankers, sessions to discuss ideas, to flesh out things. Also because, I mean, he himself enjoyed that type of activity, even if he regretted that it couldn't do as much as probably he would like. So there was clearly engagement with think tanks, to sort of to flesh out ideas, to see, where things were going. Also to see, I mean, he would test some ideas, is this being receptive or not? And then from the think tank perspective, where we relied, of course, I mean, as a think tank of the Commission, we relied a lot on the collaboration with other think tanks in Brussels and beyond Brussels, also with experts, with academics. And there sometimes, even from a strategic point of view, because we were nevertheless an internal think tank, so still within certain constraints that an independent think tank, so to say, would not have. And so many times we would collaborate with external think tanks so that they would allow us as an internal think tank to push our agenda strategically, because they could probably introduce those topics into the conversation within the institution much, in a more strategic way, even if we had a sort of a pretty ample mandate from President Juncker to this. If now I can add a point to your ugly, the ugly, the bad, and the good is that the very good is that now my life is a think tank. So I now have the opportunity to try to address some of the issues that both Anna and Christian were mentioning. And I would finish with this. I think timing, ideas, and communication are fundamental in this. And so it's the way that you first, are you there when the information is needed, as was already said? Do you have the right information? Meaning, are you actually thinking of actionable and operationable alternatives? Because that's what politicians always think. They always think of alternatives. If it's not this one, what can substitute this that is as effective as this thing that I can't do? So this is a little bit that, and then it's the communication. How do you convey that information?
Timing, ideas, communication, and we will get back to some of these points in our panel discussion, our debate. But let me come back now and get into the funding side of things. I mean, we talked about the political side of things, the journalism side of things that might also be better understanding political power. What's it like from a foundation perspective, Michael Schwartz? I mean, are you getting enough bang for your buck? You've, financed a lot of think tanks. You're investing in a lot of think tank projects. What are you actually trying to promote with this? And do you think think tanks are fitting that bill?
Yeah, thanks for this question. But before I answer it, let me just say how happy I am that we have the launch event of the Think Tank Lab, because I think it's a great example of collaboration, of community building, of joint learning. And it's part of an endeavor of our foundation to reflect and adapt our funding strategy when it comes to think tanks. So extremely happy, thankful to all the partners involved. Now to your question, when I heard the question, I was thinking about our founding family, the family that created the foundation. What would they answer if they get the question, are you happy with the way the foundation acts? Are you getting enough bang for your buck when it comes to the foundation? And I think they would answer, yeah, generally yes, but. And I think I look exactly, that would be my answer when it comes to my view on think tank funding. Generally, yes, we are happy with our partners. We see a lot of effort, smart people, organizations to try to adapt to new situations, a more collaborative approach to things. So of course we see impact in particular debates. So generally, yes. But are we happy with the state of affairs? Are we happy with the state of affairs when it comes to climate change, to democracy, to European integration, to migration policies? And I think we would all agree to say, no, we are not happy. And there's some reason to be even rather pessimistic. And so this is quite, I think, a motivation for us to become better in what we're doing. And so generally quite happy, yes. But I think the times that we witness now, and the size of the problems, the complexity of the problems, should really be a motivation for us to become even better.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're already running out of time, so to speak. We got around 8 minutes left for our panel debate. I think there was so much food for thought. Let me maybe bring in Christiane Hoffmann on this side again, because I think it's really interesting also what Ricardo mentioned, and it's a little bit also what Hannah Neumann mentioned, the question of communication. How should think tanks communicate? I mean, journalists have short pieces. Should think tanks try to be more innovative, work more with infographics, different digital designs? What means and tools? How can we best communicate this? What's your view there, Christiane?
Thank you very much for that very important question. And yes, they should do all of that, but all of what you suggested. But what I think lacks sometimes is that with every piece of communication that you do, whether it is a podcast, whether it is a paper, a long paper, a short paper, whatever, an interview, think tanks should ask themselves more thoroughly, who am I addressing this at? Because I see a lot of think tanks products where I ask myself exactly who is the addressee of this paper or of this, let's say podcast or whatever. And here, I think, and it may sound a bit contradictory to what I've said before, but what I've said before was actually focused on access to decision makers. But if you focus on communication, then think tanks shouldn't imitate journalism. And I find that there are quite some think tanks projects that give no additional information to what I can read in any newspaper, any serious newspaper. So this is, I think, superfluous. This is what think tanks don't need to do. They have to provide more specialized, more scientific, more whatever information or different information. And as a journalist, as also a consumer of think tanks, I do appreciate very much if think tanks do informations like surveys or polls or so, and they are not always very good at bringing them into the information market. So they should focus more, maybe give them to one media as an exclusive news so they can make it bigger and not just distribute them anywhere and hope that somewhere they pop up. So, and then, what we as media need is interview partners also from think tanks. And here we need either very good specialists or people who are willing to make a sharp statement. Often think tankers are just very, very moderate, and you may regret that, but this isn't the way that the publicity market works.
That's a very interesting point, right? With the attention.
Make one last wish, if I may, because I think Hannah has mentioned this already, and I think it's extremely important. With this very much changing world and all the question marks that we all have, journalists, think tankers, politicians, doubts, uncertainties, we need to discuss more, and we need to have more room for really sort of private and a discussion that is where people can trust each other, and it has to encompass politics, journalism, think tanks, maybe economy, and so on. So I see that sometimes think tanks are doing this. They're creating these formats, and they're great. I even see politicians creating these formats because they want to exchange their ideas. So there's a great need for safe space for really open discussion.
Let me also, thank you. Let me also take some questions from the chat here. One of the questions that we actually have was also addressed to you, Hannah. The question was, how do you deal with policy papers that don't necessarily fit your policy position? I mean, do you just throw them out of hand, or do you then actually challenge yourself and ask, okay, does this make sense to me? Do you try to adapt? That was one of the questions that came out. The other question was, well, what kind of policy papers would you actually read? I mean, how long You said, do you just go to the end and look at the recommendations? What do you say to that?
The first one, if I get one, I don't share the position. These are the ones I love most. That may be because of my scientific background. I don't know, but I don't need to spend my time reading a paper that just tells me I'm right. I need to read a paper that challenges what I think or says there are other options. Me personally, I prefer the papers that explore the options, as I said earlier, and then I can pick them. And that would be for me the added benefit of think tank to journalism. That really I have the options and I have them well argued and I can follow them and then make my own decisions. That's how I personally like it. I would like to pick up just quickly, sorry, Roderick, something Christiane said on the safe spaces. And here there is a very clear advice. Rather than 10 think tanks trying to do 10 discussions around largely similar topics, do one high-level one. That is really good with the key top-notch people. That's how you get us. If it's just a random one and we have 3 or 4 of them in the week, then I'm just not going to go. And then you either get the staffers or no one at all. So that's one thing Munich Security Conference is really great at, to exactly organize this one. What was the second question? Sorry, it skipped me.
Oh, it's just the length. If you could briefly say.
I don't bother the length. It has to have an executive summary and then it needs to be clearly structured. So I can immediately go to the points that catch my interest based on the executive summary. And that will be different points for everyone. It doesn't even always need to be the recommendations, but it can be like a specific part on let's say, security sector reform in Libya. I would jump there because that's my field of expertise. Others would jump to the migration one on Libya. Others would jump on something else. Just clearly structured, a good executive summary.
Fantastic. We really are running out of time, but let me add one more question here because I think it's a very important one. It's about the safe spaces and the conversation with different stakeholders and making sure that this is not just an elite discussion as well with policymakers and think tanks. So maybe Michael Schwartz, let me bring you in here. What role do think tanks have in bringing some of this policy analysis to the wider society and not just to policymakers? Also, foundations obviously have a wider view and have a look at the bigger picture. How do you see their role there?
I think they play an essential role in translating complex situations into digestible pieces and conversations. The other day, I think probably some colleagues from ECFR are with us as well. The poll on, the Europeans' view on the world that said, I don't know, only 5% of people see Turkey as an ally, 41% as an adversary or a rival. Given the importance of this society, I mean, we need to think about how we can best explain a political position that says it is a strategic ally and it's a geostrategically extremely important country, and public opinion that has a different stance on that one. And I think reducing complexity, explaining things should be higher on the agenda. And let me say one word also to about think tank work that is very important to me now. If we see what happened to the Mercator Institute for China Studies with the sanctions by the Chinese government, or what happened to Michael Kovrig from Crisis Group, I think that shows on the one hand the relevance of think tanks and its ability to shape public opinion and what authoritarian governments see in think tanks. And I think we should really all work hard on keeping that academic freedom in our societies and shouldn't be intimidated by what happens to our colleagues. And I think that is those two examples I just mentioned are painful experiences, and we should draw the right consequences out of that.
Oh, this was really a really good point, important point to make. And I'm sorry we're already out of time, but this was really a whirlwind tour from all different stakeholders important to think tanks. Thank you so much for sharing your input with us. And I'm very happy to pass the floor over to Henry Altaka from the Robert Bosch Stiftung. What were your main takeaways? What should Robin Niblett in his keynote really have a look at?
I'm too modest to give advice to Robin on what to talk about in his keynote, but when we talked beforehand on who should take which role at this opening, I must have drawn the shortest match, because and now I have 3 to 5 minutes to summarize this far too diverse and complex panel. But maybe 3 things I wanna say that I think struck me most, and then maybe 3 things that I think were missing in the discussion. The 3 things that struck me most were client orientation, comments on the substance, and comments on the format. And I think on the client orientation, what every speaker has said so far is, people have little time to read. It gets through lots of filter stages. And when a study is done is key. And I think many think tanks nowadays are still not ready yet to cater that much to their client base in preparing their input when it is actually needed. And they're often disappointed when it's not being picked up when another agenda is high up on another point is high up on the agenda. On the substance, what I found very interesting is Hannah's comment that she doesn't want too much of a guided paper, which is contradicting slightly the study that Christiane commented earlier that we did, because there the criticism was often that think tanks don't give clear enough opinions and clear enough suggestions. But if I understand Hannah correctly, then she wants more suggestions and then pick hers that fits her agenda and her political opinion, which is I find a very relevant and important point. And Christiane's comment on, but make those options realistic. Don't dream in the kind of ivory tower of academic science, but actually, give advice that is realistic. And data, polls, statistics, kind of all those information that for an individual investigative journalist are hard to come by. And the third one on the format, I found interesting Hannah's comment on, don't put too many fancy graphics and interactive stuff online. I want a document with a clear kind of structure and executive summary. I mean, this is great to hear. So text is not dead. So thank you on that. And maybe just 3 things that I felt were missing, and maybe they're coming up in the discussions later. One is the exchange between those domains, because we talked a lot about how the consumer, whether it's a journalist or a politician or a think tank, and the producer foundation, or producer think tank don't actually understand each other. And maybe we need more exchanges between those domains and those sectors, more the revolving door that we have in North America. The second thing is one of the suggestions, our study that Christiane was writing was, be more controversial. Dear think tanks, don't be too polite. Don't stick too much to the mainstream. Say things that are not in the mainstream. And I think the response often is, well, yeah, but we have to cater to our funders, to our whether it's a parliament or a foundation. So we as a foundation at the Robert-Stiftung are now moving more to unrestricted institutional funding in order to give more freedom to think tanks. And the last point, over-domination of Western think tanks. The think tank market is still a very Anglo-Saxon, Western, global North market, which is no longer timely. The world is more complex than that. We cannot have people in London and Washington explaining us Africa and Asia. We need to have the global South involved in those debates. There's a lot of intellectual expertise that we're not tapping into yet. And that is something that the Robert-Stiftung is also trying to bridge. It is not easy, but it is essential. So thank you very much.
I have the pleasure to introduce our keynote commentator for today. It is Dr. Robin Niblett. Robin Niblett has been the director and chief executive of Chatham House, also known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, since 2007. Before joining Chatham House, he served as executive vice president and chief operating officer of Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, another premier think tank. And Robin Niblett is a thought leader on the future of think tanks who has written and spoken widely on the topic. Many of you might be familiar with his 2018 article on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Chatham House, I believe, rediscovering a sense of purpose, the challenge for Western think tanks. Dr. Niblett, we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts. What can think tanks do at a time like this, having heard all of these expectations and thoughts? to become incubators for policy innovation, to, maybe leave our echo chambers where it might be very comfortable at times, to stop only preaching to the converted, to maybe also let in some fresh perspectives and produce more innovative thinking. Over to you, Robin.
Thanks very much for this opportunity to join you all on this important day with the launch of the Think Tank Lab. Congratulations to all of you, and looking forward to see what you come up with and the ideas. And already, I think we've had a really excellent conversation. And I like doing it the reverse way around, actually getting some ideas on the table before having any sort of semi-prepared statements. And it meant I only semi-prepared as a result, because I wanted to have some flexibility. But to Mikko and Cathryn, great to be with you on this event, as well as with many good friends on the panel that preceded as well. Now, being a Brit, what I do is I follow the exam question. And the exam question you gave me, and I'm going to stick with it actually, rather than commenting on what I heard before, is how can think tanks become incubators for policy innovation? And I think those words, incubator for policy innovation, is really important, because actually it's quite different to what we've been talking about. Most think tanks are not policy innovators. And some of the criticism we've heard so far is about whether think tanks are policy relevant. But the question as well, and the question you've given us, is can we be policy innovators? I think most think tanks like to think that they are sources of information and analysis. They certainly convene. I would like to think, based on the comments I heard so far, especially from Hannah, that if we're doing our job, we do provide safe spaces. And there's certainly no shortage of spaces, endless conversations taking place right now. But that comment about safe spaces, if we are doing our job, we will provide that safe space, that semi-confidential space that also gets the information out. I think, obviously, we do try to seek to influence the policy debate. But even there, innovation isn't always essential. You don't have to innovate to be influential. A lot of the decision-making for policymakers, and again, we heard it from Hannah, is how to prioritize, not to be told what to do, but to decide what is the more important choice, or to be given a list of prioritization. Do you emphasize more climate change or more on women's education? Where does it fit on the scale of priorities? Or you can have advice simply on changing policy. The whole debate about China. Do you engage? Do you contest? How do you do the differentiation between the two? Clearly, there's a view that many Western governments have had the wrong balance, and that balance needs to change. Think tanks can communicate to that prioritization and that sense of change. Is the 2% target of GDP as a contributor to defense spending, is that a blunt target? Think tanks should have a view on this. But to be frank, none of that's about innovation. It's really about prioritization, ideas, etc. And I think why I was intrigued by the title you gave here, and I think it's good that we're, if I can say, taking the conversation just beyond relevance to innovation, is that certainly we're in a world where the status quo is unacceptable. Whether it's growth models, whether it is addressing climate change, how to build resilience, the status quo is unacceptable, and the status quo ante is unacceptable as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this term build back better. The idea is no one wants to go back to the old normal. So I think this idea of think tanks not just coming up with ideas for policymakers and competing with all the other people trying to give them ideas, including the policymakers themselves, the idea of creating the space to be incubators of innovation in the policy space is going to become more important. And it's going to require adaptation by think tanks beyond the ideas that were discussed in the panel. In the end, innovation, I asked somebody once to describe what innovation is, because it's a very overused word. But somebody said, innovation is about coming up with new ideas that draw from new connections. But innovation is all about getting things done. It's about solving the problem. It is not simply about, coming up with a nice idea. It's actually getting into the mix and having it delivered. So what are some of the challenges for think tanks to innovate? I'm just going to give three of the challenge, I think, that block us from innovation. One actually is expertise. I mean, I was very struck by the comments that Christian Hoffmann made, and I'll come to a couple of reactions to them in a second. But just the first point, certainly at Chatham House, and I think a lot of the think tanks, we like to be homes for experts. Groups of people who really specialize, maybe they have PhDs in subjects, they've gone deep. They like to think, they may or may not be right, Christian, that they maybe know more than journalists because they've taken the time to get a PhD or something and go deep in a particular way. They may not have gone deep on the policy side, but they've gone deep into the issue. So hopefully if they're doing their job, they will have expertise of a sort that could be relevant for the policy space and provide a good dialogue for the media and for other communities. But the problem is that expertise tends to be siloed. Expertise tends to create little columns, and think tank structures tend to reflect that siloization. And silos, I think, are the opposite of what enables you to have innovation, especially when you're looking for big answers to wicked problems like climate change, inequity, etc. So that's the first problem we have. Second, and this will sound weird, actually being policy relevant can be an obstacle to innovate, I think, because we spend most of our time trying to influence people that either don't have time to hear new ideas or not particularly interested always in new ideas. What they want to do is to be confirmed in the idea they're doing, or to have a selection, a set of options, as Hannah was saying, but that are trusted and tried and that already sit inside the public debate. To innovate is difficult for politicians, as I'm sure any of the people would say here. Ironically, Christian, to your point, I think the problem of European think tanks may be that they don't always understand policy. The problem of some of the most influential think tanks in the world, the US think tanks, I've worked there and I know it well, is actually they know policy too well. They're too connected to the policy process and the policymakers. They already have the frameworks of their ideas preordained, pre-decided. Actually being away from power can perhaps help you be more innovative in your thinking. Of course, it doesn't mean then you'll be influential, and all your points about communication and how you connect and being to the point and all of the stuff that Ricardo and Hannah in particular are mentioning, and Michael as well from his side, and Henry, those will come to bear. If we're talking about innovation, policy relevance and trying to be policy relevant can be an obstacle. The last obstacle, of course, is funding. Because funding has become, certainly since the 1980s and 90s, more specialized. Whether it's foundations, whether it's companies, governments as well. Often government agencies or particular foundations want to fund specialists. They've got a particular idea, a particular guideline they want to achieve. And that makes it difficult for think tanks to innovate. You find yourself trying to wrap yourself around the demand of the funders. So it's going to require, as I'll say in a minute, some long-term thinking from funders to get us there. Now, I've left myself, if my timing was right, don't go over 10, 12 minutes, about 3 or 4 minutes to give the answers. And I've got 10, okay? So I'm going to give maybe 30 seconds on each one. Hopefully, Clay will keep me to that. But these are just ideas for conversation. And they're not original, many of them, but I think they're still worth restating. Number one, we need to involve new communities in our work. Now, by new communities, I don't just mean civil society, which I think think tanks do a much better job at engaging these days than they did before. And I think we do a pretty good job in these days involving business. And by the way, business are often some of the most innovative, action-focused communities. And a lot of think tanks are very sniffy, if you understand, you get that British word about involving business. But I've found business often to be less interfering and actually more constructive than some other stakeholders in think tank business. But artists, technologists, psychologists, PR firms, people who are into rethinking how you communicate, how humans react to change, complex, wicked problems are about problems of collective action, aren't always problems of policy. They're often problems of individual mobilization. And therefore, you need a totally different community. So I'll just give one example. We've partnered in a thing called the London Design Biennale, a thing called the Age of Crisis. You can find it online. but we engaged with all sorts of people we've never engaged with before to come up with ideas about how you can bring about change. So first of all, involve new communities. Second, obvious, more young voices. We've had for a long time at Chatham House a panel of senior advisors. Well, this year we created a panel of young advisors. And actually, we're going to put the two of them together for so like having a young advisory board. And obviously, making sure that you can get in those young advisors often more of the balance of gender and ethnic diversity, which bring those ideas that will then lead to innovation, is incredibly important. We've been doing actually with MacArthur this concept of an inclusive governance initiative, and inclusivity for innovation, I think, is going to be incredibly important. Third point, engage these communities in your work, don't educate them. There's a big think tanks, we provide information. But these days, a lot of communities that are going to drive change and innovate need to have the sense of agency. You've got to help them have the agency to do what they want to do. And again, I'll mention something here we're doing with the Bosch Foundation, a Common Futures conversation, which is getting young people from Africa and Europe to design their own futures. We just act as the conveners and maybe the incubators of their conversation. And I think the kind of hybrid meetings that we're going to be moving into should allow more of both these elements. Fourth point, and I think somebody else used this term in the panel discussion right now, how do you create new forms of policy resonance? Again, I think it's almost old-fashioned to think that we'll be most influential when we get through to the key decision makers. Because the key decision makers these days often don't take decisions without knowing that the idea you've given them already has resonance. So we as think tanks have to be involved in creating resonance. If we create the resonance, then actually a lot of the policymakers might get involved with the idea. And it's that kind of creating more of a holistic community is incredibly important. You have to create the demand for the policy change and working, I think, with policymakers to incubate that kind of space is incredibly important. Fifth, offer a vision that's inspiring. It's not just about knowing how policy works, it's engaging people around a vision. We've just done a thing called Futurescape, where we've done a 3D model you can walk around and navigate. Again, you can get on our website as part of our centenary, of what Piccadilly Circus might look like in 30, 50, 100 years' time. Again, I haven't got time to go into it, but we teamed up with all sorts of people, and you can get conversations from them and go around the website, a bit like you've done with your think tank space. And I think what it does is when people have a sense of where you could go, they then work out what the policy answers might be to get there, rather than starting with the policy to try to work out where you're going. So I think a vision becomes part of incubating innovation. I think on visualization, I'll accelerate here because I'm coming to the end of my time. I know that Hannah said these don't always help. I think that visualizations, if they kind of almost shock and capture a dimension, it can be valuable. We did some work on Libya on how influential specific warlord groups are and how connected they are into the business of insecurity. That actually, if you want to change the situation in Libya, you actually have to get into the war economy. It's not about a peace treaty. It's not even about human rights. It's literally about economic incentives. And it was all because we did a visualization that we found very useful. Last points. I think, therefore, as I said earlier, maybe less emphasis on programmatic expertise would actually help us innovate more than we did before. More crossover work inside the think tanks. I remember when the New America Foundation was founded, I was in Washington, so 16, 17, maybe 18 years ago now. They saw themselves as the anti-think tank. They were going to have no specialists. It was all going to be made up of people who thought across the board, the kind of Parag Khanas and so on of this world, historians. I think there's a way of trying to maybe get away from an overemphasis on programmatic expertise. Innovation through learning, simulations are an amazing way for people to suddenly get a breakthrough idea that you can't get through even writing a good executive summary and a good report. Simulations, tabletops, we all do them already, but I think they're incredibly important for innovation. Last 2 points, focus on language. It's not always about changing the policy. It's often about changing the terms around which policy is designed. We did a thing about counterfeit medicines with the World Health Organization. They couldn't get the policy worked out on counterfeit medicine because no one could agree what a counterfeit medicine was. And by working on the language, you were able to get the breakthrough. Last point, we need more central funding. If you don't have funding that is untied or more untied funding, it's incredibly difficult to be innovative. So I go back to the point I made earlier, and I mean, it's not a plea, but I think I've worked at think tanks long enough, I can throw that on the table. And certainly if I look at what Bosch and others have done, I think they've gone in that direction, MacArthur and others, and some of the big US think tanks that went very specialist, Ford, MacArthur, and now starting to think big again. And I think that's a very encouraging sign. Claire, I'll stop there. I did a full 15 minutes, I'm afraid. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Robin, for sharing your thoughts and your observations about how think tanks can become more innovative. Now, I'm inviting our panelists from earlier back to the stage, but I will start us off with 3 questions that our audience sent us ahead of the event to Robin, and then we will take up some more questions to all of the panelists. And I would like to invite also the audience, if you haven't yet, feel free to ask further questions in the chat, and we will try to take them up as we go. So my questions to Robin. We've had the expectations of a policymaker who became a think tanker, a journalist, and a donor. What is your recipe for think tanks to stay independent in our analysis and advice in the face of this concert of expectations?
That's such a difficult question, such a good question. How to stay independent? Well, look, one way to stay independent is to make sure your funding is diverse. By the way, not everyone has the luxury of being independent. Let's just be frank about this. We're very fortunate, I think, in Europe, in the United States, to be considered part of civil society. And in most countries, an independent civil society is seen as part of effective government, even if it's not always appreciated and sometimes resented. But the media is the same. Yeah, people don't always like getting criticized by the media, but I think we appreciate, hopefully, in most countries, most governments appreciate the value they bring. So, but how to keep independence? I think it's a combination of elements. I know it's boring to go about funding, but in the end, we are creatures of like everyone, of how we exist and how we survive. So the approach we've taken is diversity of sources and diversity of means. We're fortunate to have a membership structure that provides us some untied funding. But beyond that, we get from diverse governments and from diverse constituencies. I think in the end, you've got to make sure you don't take money from governments that don't expect an answer. I mean, you just have to say no. And in fact, part of independence for a think tank is being able to say no. But to be able to say no, you've got to get yourself to a position, obviously, to say no. I'm not naive about these things. In the end, independence then is about leadership. It's about board, and leadership is not just the CEO. Leadership is about governance. It's about having a board that treats the independence as utterly fundamental, that sees its role as a guardian of that independence, that's willing to go to bat for the executive and for the analysts when they come under pressure, as they inevitably will if they're being independent. And then I suppose it's about recruiting people who are independent of mind. You can have strong opinions. You probably should have strong opinions if you work in a think tank, but we are not advocacy organizations. So we don't start with the answer and then work out the evidence. You've got to go where the evidence takes you. Sometimes it doesn't take you where you wanted to start. I've had to go back to funders and say, we've got a bit of a problem here. Actually, the idea we thought we had when we developed the proposal isn't going the way we thought it would. So I think it's about funding, governance structure, and then picking the right people and setting the right expectation, not having polemicists, if I may say so, but having people who are willing to follow the evidence, but then not be shy about coming up with a strong idea. So that would be, I could spend a whole afternoon on independence, but I'll make those 3 points.
I like the independence, and I really wrote down the go where the evidence takes you phrase you put. I just hope politics still has this ambition as well. I mean, it's guided by a set of values, but I still hope we can reach that. in terms of independence, I really think the membership structure is one. Maybe the journalists and the think tankers should talk to each other on this one, because I think you face pretty much the same challenges with this kind of, and what information should be free and as a service to the public, and how do we actually generate funds? Because I mean, as soon as you enter into third-party funding, and even getting money from governments is somehow a third-party funding that comes with a certain ambition. There is always, let's say, at least some limitations of independence. So it has to be a good mix. I mean, you know all of that, but I really think maybe journalists and think tankers should talk on the independence and how to monetize knowledge issue.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you made there, because the American think tanks and even the Brits that were founded over 100 years ago, pretty early on got themselves endowments, and those endowments provided a source of funding. Although it did reflect the donors, obviously, in their view of the world, they were pretty independent. And a lot of the American institutions have kept that, but it is unique, as far as I can tell, globally. And most others, have to compete. I think your comment about whether we should talk to journalists is very interesting. I mean, obviously, I think, Christian, it's fair to say, in journalism, I mean, you're under the pressure also to make a profit, correct? Not simply. Yeah, so there's a business dimension, which I think even goes beyond what we at think tanks. We have to survive. I think that media has to prosper, but media ownership is quite a sensitive issue, isn't it, Christian?
It is, although I mean we're not there yet that we are financed actually by government or politicians. So it's a different question. I mean, we have had all these discussions about foundations financing journalism, which, and even government foundations, which I think is completely excluded. Foundations, maybe, yes, private, but not government, because we are much closer in working with governments than you are. And I think this is our special journalistic independence problem, is that, we can be put under pressure by politicians, by, if they exclude us from sources of information and so on and so on. So this is the way they try to pressurize us rather than financial. And so this is our independence problem is a bit of a different one from yours, I think.
I was just wondering whether my comments about innovation being different from influence, if you see what I'm saying, it's just something that came to me as I prepared to say some remarks today. And was I making sense? Is it different, or do we have to do the same things? I don't know. I feel I should be asking Ricardo or Michael or Henry.
If you allow me, Robin, when you were speaking on your 10 points, I thought, okay, Robin has also converted to foresight, because a lot of the things that you've said have been part of my work over the past years, and in the foresight community. A lot of the things that you mentioned there that are relevant in terms of, more inclusivity of different communities, so sort of the visualization, the having a vision, so walking from that vision to the present. And
we can actually hear your very interesting discussion from here, most part of it, but we were not able to reconnect, so we had some technical glitch. I'm very sorry for that, but I'm very sure you did the best of the time you could. I would just quickly, if you allow, go back to the two questions that I had to Robin, because I know that he has to leave us in about 3 minutes. So one thing that I found particularly interesting in what you said, and we will definitely come back to you to ask you to wrap up these 10 points that you gave us for more innovative thinking work. Maybe we can make a piece out of this for our website. But one thing that I found particularly interesting was that you said that expertise can lead to silos, and silos stand in the way of innovation. And what I was wondering is if you have maybe a recipe or advice for, because you are a director of a think tank, you said it's also about leadership. How do you break up these silos, and how do you build the mindset and the skills internally for this new kind of engagement instead of education, because it's a very different kind of conversation that you ask us to have with the public, with new communities, with architects, with artists, with technologists, etc. So how do you build the mindset and the skills internally for this kind of engagement? How do you break up the silos?
It's very difficult. If I had a simple answer, it's funny you should mention this. In fact, Ricardo and I were talking about before this extent to which actually we are grappling with these issues today. All of us, I think. It is very difficult because my view is I don't think tanks should lose that specialism, that capacity to think long term, to have the space and the time to go deep on issues and to bring the depth. But the depth, in a way, is only valuable for wicked problems if it can be combined. So it really is a challenge for management in how you design projects, in how you structure research teams, in how you evaluate performance, in how you think about literally, your remuneration for staff and how you gauge it. Because in the end, what you're asking your colleagues to do is not just be what they are for what you hired them to do, but to go beyond their comfort zone. And so I think the techniques for this are kind of obvious. They're to develop joint research projects, we now have a research committee of our board and an internal research committee, which meets monthly to design and to talk about projects. Before, it was a very, everyone followed their own little track. And as long as they were being influential and covering their budgets and doing good work and having impact in their specific areas, that was good enough. But now we're expecting at least 20, 30% of our senior program managers' time to be dedicated towards joint projects. And this is why I said the issue about central funding, because the thing that distracts you from that is easier for them to get the funding on the specialist issue. So where we then as central managers have to spend more time helping build the networks up with the donor community to say, look, we really do have a vision and we've got a team and we've got a way of addressing this topic in a joined up way. So look, there's no simple magic wand. This is work. But I think it is the business of all of us on this call, us in the think tanks and those on the communities that we work with and we reach out to all be on the same wavelength, I suppose, and to be working towards the same outcomes. And then it's up to us to do good quality work, and then that'll get funded. If it's not, it won't. But it's about operational management almost. And Ricardo was talking about the way I think the private sector as well has kind of organized itself to do this. And we need to professionalize a little bit as well. Rather than being a sort of universities without students, we need to become quite professional organizations to have impact in these modern ways.
Thank you very much for sharing some insider recipes also from your own organization and some examples also of innovative projects. I've seen the Futurescape website. I can really recommend having a look at it. So it's very interesting and inspiring indeed. Before you leave us, one last question to you and also to Ricardo. Given the current European football championship, allow me to use an analogy from the sports arena. So in Germany, we have the saying that when the match starts, there are 80 million football trainers who know exactly what went wrong and what they would have done better. So in a way, commenting from the sidelines seems easy. What would it take for you, Robin, and for you, Ricardo, to leave the role of advisor and enter the field to become a politician yourself?
Oh, that's a very good question. Look, I think I'm torn about this because I think there is this issue where maybe us, and I'll speak for myself, I won't speak to other communities and think tanks, but when you don't have the opportunity to move in and out of government the way that you do in the US system in particular, and rarely, but occasionally in some other spaces, but where it's not the norm, you do start to feel that, are you really rolling your sleeves up and making the difference that you like to think you're making, or hope to think you're making? The reality is, I think politics is combat. And it is partisan. Certainly, I speak for the UK, but I've seen it in America and you see it in most other places. And certainly for me, the compromises I fear I would have to make to be able to succeed in politics has gone beyond what I would feel comfortable doing and to be myself and to be what I want to do. So I've walked up to that mental conversation, had it with myself, and stepped away from it. I think hopefully those in politics, those like Hannah, who I'm sure grappled with the other side of the dilemma to the one that we've grappled with. I think our job is to be as supportive as we can to those who are in the trenches, if I can put it that way, trying to make policy happen as opposed to what it should be and look like. I'm very humble, if I can put it that way, in the face of what people who go into politics have to take on these days. I feel I got a cushier option, but certainly in the world that I'm in, and certainly in the UK, politics is highly partisan, such that it's very difficult to even approach that ability to have the freedom that I suppose we can enjoy in think tanks to make the kind of difference I want to. Difficult question, but we better be part of a team. You know, as I said, I do not underestimate the difficulties and the importance of the role that the policy community plays.
Thank you very much for your interesting keynote comment. And thank you for being with us today. As I said, this is also a question I would like to ask to Ricardo. So do you, what brought you from the policy sphere back to the think tank, and what would make you become actually like a decision maker in politics? Maybe just a very short perspective from your side.
Listen, very short. It's not that I haven't thought about it. Of course I did, but I think there are issues. As far as I understand, and also from speaking with friends, I'm not only too outspoken, so I just speak my mind. And on most occasions, so that normally tends to get politicians in trouble. And other friends say that I'm too naive or too nice or sometimes too idealistic on certain things, which also so that I don't have sort of the so-called killer instinct for politics. Okay, so these are sort of the appreciation that friends and colleagues have. For me, from a personal perspective, I would say first is, it's the scrutiny on your sort of personal and private life that I would probably feel uncomfortable with that level of scrutiny, because I value my privacy. And also, I think what would really make for me a difference is that I would need to be in an office, and then probably I would be more interested in local politics, to be in a place where I can actually see change happening. So that would be more appealing, because I like action. I like to make decisions. I like to implement and to do things. I like to put my hands on stuff. So in that sense, this is where I see things. The think tank life, what it allows me is really this freedom to discuss ideas. We tend to always have this expression that great minds think alike. I like to think that great minds think unlike. That we need to have different views, different ideas, different approaches to things, because that's really where we're going to get things right. And I think for think tanking, that's really, really relevant. So for the moment, I think I'll stay with think tanking. I
would like to give the last word in this discussion to Hannah. And I did see the questions from the chat. I have the feeling that the incentive for internal collaboration and the question about how to align personal incentives with the goal to provide and independence with a goal to provide what policymakers would like to have. This was very much already part of the first part of the panel discussion earlier today, and also with what Robin Niblett said about trying to give them 20 to 30% to joint projects internally. So I would like to give the last word of our discussion to Hannah, who also started us off today. The question is, do you remember a concrete piece of information, of commentary or recommendation coming from a think tank that changed the way you thought about and the course of action you took maybe on a policy issue you were working on?
What I always found very inspiring, especially when I started my work in the European Parliament, were the pieces that helped me to understand the different cultures and understanding of security and defense in the different EU member states. Because I only basically knew how we Germans think of it, and I could tell you how every political party does it. But here it's about, well, how the French system works, how they approach it, how the British do. Then it's very different with the Polish, with the Italian, with the Spanish. And if you want to grapple the dynamics, you need to be aware of all of that. I'm getting better at understanding it myself, like months after months. But for someone in the European arena, that's always super helpful. And this really helped me better maneuver also with my colleagues in the European Parliament.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. Now, the reason why we're all here, of course, and we are aware of the time, is that we are launching our new initiative, the Think Tank Lab, and we would like to take your attention here for the last 5 minutes to give you a quick introduction to what we plan, how it all came about, and how you could get engaged if you want it. So since the idea for the Think Tank Lab as a space for systematic exchange of ideas and best practice came up, we have talked with many other think tanks from other organizations in Germany and abroad, with think tank funders and addressees. Over the past 2 years, we organized 2 co-creation workshops, 3 focus groups, several stakeholder interviews, and all that just to learn what are the challenges and opportunities that think tanks in Germany and abroad are facing today, both externally and internally. And we've heard many words on that today. We also asked them how the Think Tank Lab itself could be of support to tackle these challenges, what structures, what offer, what activities might actually add value. And we also asked think tankers what are their visions and dreams and ideas. We asked both think tank directors and senior managers, as well as early career staff and interns. We wanted to know what their dreams were when it comes to the future of think tanking as a profession, as a practice, and how we could maybe help us all get there. So the way the Think Tank Lab is set up right now, the way you can explore the 3 pillars of our work on the website, is the product of all of these conversations. It was not just thought up in our own office.
I mean, the first pillar we call a community of practice. And I think looking back to some of the conversations that we had earlier in the panel discussions as well, the question came up about creating, or the need to create these safe spaces. And I think that's this community practice. That's what it's all about. We want to create a community where think tankers, think tank organizations can come together, exchange views, share experiences, have a safe space where they can learn from each other, maybe also discuss things that they think aren't going so well, things where they feel uncomfortable. So we will do this by having workshops, having working groups. We're going to have 4 events a year. This year, we still have 2 events coming up in the second half. And we'll also have a flagship event, which will be our annual Think Tank Lab conference. Now, turning to the second pillar is actually the Think Tank Lab School. We've realized that there is a lot of need also for think tankers to have opportunities for continuing education, continuing training, which at the moment is not really out there. And we want to change that by having the schools, which will run once a year. It has 3 modules, and there you'll get trainings and workshops on issues such as foresight, big data analysis. What role should big data play, artificial intelligence play when it comes to think tanks? We'll also have a study trip to Brussels or perhaps to London. So there's a big array of workshops and trainings that we're offering with the Think Tank School there. And last but not least is our toolbox. The toolbox is our third pillar. The toolbox is where all of the best practices, good practices, all the ideas, the policy innovation ideas that we get, the ways of working that we get, comes together and will be made publicly available for other think tankers and think tanks to use, so that we actually are able to spread this information and get this information out there. And of course, we also want all of you to get engaged and get engaged with us and get the think tank community together and create some kind of a solidarity spirit as well. So if you want to get involved, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. I'll pass over to Claire again to say a bit more about what's coming up soon.
So what will we do in the next 6 months? As I said in the very beginning, you're invited to take a look yourself at the infographic that we have right next to the video stream to have a clearer picture of what is coming up until the end of this year. In July, we will launch 2 calls for applications for fellow think tankers and other stakeholders involved with think tanks to join 2 working groups. And in these working groups, we want to address 2 organizational challenges that were important to many of the participants of our focus groups in April. The first one is the question how we might foster diversity in German think tanks. Robin Niblett said it, many others mentioned it. Diversity is integral and foundational for innovation. So studies have shown again and again, unfortunately, that Western think tanks, including German ones, are far from being reflective of the diversity in our society, both in our workforce and on our conference panels. So in this working group, we want to bring those together from different organizations who care for diversity and inclusion to analyze what stands in the way of more diversity in German think tanks, what good practices might be out there, and what can we do together to move ahead on this. We will work together with a consultant who has advised many research institutions on diversity management and also use elements from design sprint methodology to address this question holistically. In working group 2, we will address the question how we might improve the onboarding experience for new think tankers. In our research, we've learned that onboarding new colleagues is a challenge for many organizations. And Roderick mentioned that before. Several colleagues shared that they struggled to navigate the think tank business and find their role when they first started working at a think tank. And especially smaller organizations find it difficult to provide a structured onboarding process. So in this second working group, we want to get all of those together who want to change this and co-create a starter kit, so to say, for new think tanks. So we don't know yet how this starter kit will look like, what form it might take. So this will all be up to that working group. So both of these working groups will run from August until December. And we are, of course, aware, as you are as well, I'm sure, that these are very big challenges that we won't be able to solve once and for all in 5 months' time. But we want to start the conversation and we want to get those together who are passionate about these topics. And we are curious what difference we actually can make in such a limited time frame if we bring colleagues from different think tanks together. In September, the think tank school that Roderick mentioned will open its doors to the pilot cohort. With the think tank school, we are creating a training offer for think tankers working in a research department of German think tanks with 2 to 5 years of relevant professional experience. And as Roderick said, this is a kind of offer that we created because we saw that especially smaller organizations, but also bigger ones, find it difficult to provide in-house training because of limited core funding or because of limited size of the institutions. So we decided to create an offer to pool this and invite everyone to join us. The school will run from September to December, and it contains 2 face-to-face training modules in Berlin, 1 study trip to Brussels, inshallah, and self-organized work on individual policy projects and peer coaching. We hope that you will learn how to understand real-life policy processes better and how to understand stakeholder needs, how to develop and communicate policy recommendations in line with many of the things we've heard today from our panelists, how to raise funds for policy projects, or at least some tips and advice on the way. And of course, you will be able to build your own professional network as a school attendant with both policymakers and fellow think tankers. The call for applications for the think tank school will also be sent out in July. And for those of you who'd like to join the conversation, but don't have that much time to devote to either of the working groups or the school, you are much welcome to join one of our Think Tank Impulses events, which are planned for September and November. And there, as Roderick said, we will discuss current trends in think tanking, such as the role of artificial intelligence in think tank work.
And last, but certainly not least, as I mentioned, do get engaged with the Think Tank Lab, do get in contact. There are different ways you can get in touch. If you only have a minute, get on the website, drop us a line by mail, say, look, I'm interested, or sign up for our mailing list. If you got a couple of more minutes, maybe also go to Twitter and follow us there. If you have an hour, get in touch and say you want to join us for one of our workshops or one of our working groups. The calls are coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and then you'll be able to sign up for them. And if you have even more time, you can, of course, apply for the think tank school as well. There's lots of different opportunities to get engaged with us. We want to get this community started. We're really happy that you all joined us for this event today. And I'm excited to move forward with the Think Tank Lab. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists of today and to our keynote commentator, who have all shared their insights and their expectations and observations from their various perspectives from inside and outside of think tanks. Thank you to all of you in the audience for the thought-provoking questions, for introducing yourselves in the chat, for being here and starting this initiative together. And thank you, of course, to the whole Think Tank Lab team and events team who made this event possible today, including our event engineers, web designers from Mosaic, and our friends at Soapbox Design Agency who created the great animations and infographic for us today. Thank you all for launching the Think Tank Lab together with us here today. We're looking forward to stay in touch. This is just the beginning, and to continue or start collaborating with all of you in the upcoming 3 years. See you soon.